Some people don't belong at the front anymore. Daniel Brooks' voice carried smoothly across the ballroom, polished like the crystal glasses lining every table, and for a moment, the laughter that followed felt rehearsed, as if the room had been waiting for permission to find it amusing, and then the camera of attention, unspoken but precise, shifted toward the back, where Evelyn Carter sat exactly where he had arranged her to be, at a table near the service doors where waiters passed more often than guests lingered, her chair slightly misaligned with the rest, as if even the furniture understood she wasn't meant to be seen tonight, and yet she was unmistakably, undeniably there, dressed not in anything extravagant, but in something quietly deliberate, a soft ivory dress that caught the chandelier light just enough to remind anyone looking twice that elegance didn't need an invitation. It carried itself. And she didn't flinch when a woman 2 tables over leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind a half-covered smile, nor when a man glanced at her name card and then back at Daniel with a raised brow that asked a question no one dared say out loud, because everyone in that room remembered, at least vaguely, that she used to be more than this seat, more than a shadow placed politely at the edge of a celebration she had once belonged to, and Daniel, standing tall near the stage with a glass of champagne in hand, wore the kind of confidence that comes from rewriting a story and believing no one would challenge the edit, his tailored suit sharp against the golden lighting, his new life curated in every detail from the guest list to the seating chart, and especially that seating chart, because putting Evelyn in the back wasn't an accident. It was a statement, subtle enough to deny, obvious enough to sting, and he didn't look at her again after that line. Not directly, because humiliation works best when it pretends not to exist, when it lingers in the air like perfume no one admits to noticing, but Evelyn noticed everything, the clink of silverware, the low hum of conversations that rose and fell like distant waves, the way the waiter hesitated half a second longer at her table as if unsure whether she was part of the event or just passing through, and she folded her hands gently in her lap, posture straight, shoulders relaxed, as if she had chosen this seat herself, as if this distance was intentional, and maybe in some quiet, unspoken way, it was, because her eyes didn't search the room for validation, didn't follow Daniel or his laughter or the woman now standing beside him in a dress that shimmered louder than necessary. Instead, her gaze rested somewhere steady, somewhere inward, where noise couldn't reach, and if anyone had been close enough to notice, they would have seen that there was no trace of embarrassment in her expression, no flicker of anger either, just a calm so complete it almost felt out of place in a room designed for display, and that was the first thing that didn't fit. Not the dress, not the seat, but her stillness. The way she seemed untouched by the arrangement meant to diminish her, as if she were sitting in a different version of the night altogether, one no one else had been invited to witness yet, and as Daniel raised his glass for another toast, the applause swelling once more around him, Evelyn reached for the water in front of her, taking a small, unhurried sip, her fingers steady, her breathing even, and in that quiet motion, almost invisible to the room, there was something else, something not yet revealed but already present, like the pause before a shift in music, subtle but certain. And though no one at that moment could have named it, the truth was already unfolding, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of composure that doesn't ask to be seen, because it knows, eventually, it will be impossible to ignore. There had been a time when she sat at the front without trying, when her name was spoken before his and not as an afterthought, when the same room that now pretended not to see her had once turned toward her with quiet admiration, and it did not begin with wealth or status or anything that could be measured in numbers. It began in a small apartment that barely stretched 900 square feet, where the mornings smelled like fresh coffee and ambition, instead of distance and silence, where Daniel used to laugh without checking who was watching, where Evelyn believed that building a life meant building it together, and back then, she wore simpler dresses not because she had to, but because she did not need more to feel enough. She had been the one who stayed up late helping him refine presentations, the one who remembered the names of people he wanted to impress, the one who believed in a future that had not yet learned how to betray her, and When his first real success arrived, it came quietly, like most meaningful things do, a promotion, then another opportunity, then invitations to rooms that required a different kind of voice, a sharper kind of presence, and somewhere between those transitions, something shifted, not all at once, not in a way anyone could point to, but gradually, like a conversation that loses warmth sentence by sentence until it becomes something else entirely, and she noticed it in the way he started. Correcting her in public, lightly at first, almost playful, then with a tone that lingered a little too long, as if he needed others to hear that he knew more, that he had outgrown something or someone, and the nights grew quieter, the spaces between them wider even when they sat inches apart, and there was one evening she remembered more clearly than the others, not because it was louder, but because it was final, when she stood in the kitchen holding a cup that had gone cold in her hands. While he spoke in that same polished voice he used in boardrooms, explaining their life as if it were a contract that no longer made sense, saying words like alignment and direction and timing, words that sounded professional enough to disguise what they really meant, and when she asked him if there was someone else, he did not deny it immediately, which was answer enough, and in that pause, something inside her did not break the way stories often suggest. It simply settled, like dust finding its place after the air stops moving, and she nodded once, not because she agreed, but because she understood that whatever they had built no longer included her, and even then she did not raise her voice, did not ask him to stay, did not remind him of who she had been in his life, because something quieter had already begun forming beneath the surface, something that did not need his recognition to exist, and when she walked away from that apartment for the last time, carrying only what fit into 2 suitcases and a sense of stillness she could not yet name, she did not look back, not out of strength, not yet, but out of clarity, because the version of her that had stood beside him was already becoming someone else, someone who would learn how to exist without being placed, without being chosen, without needing a seat at any table that required her to shrink to fit it, and now, sitting at the back of a room he believed defined her worth, she remembered none of it with bitterness, only with distance, like a story she had once lived but no longer needed to revisit, and as the laughter rose again somewhere near the front, Evelyn Carter simply adjusted her glass slightly to the right, aligning it with the edge of the table, a small, precise movement that mirrored something deeper, something unseen, as if she had already begun rearranging more than just what was in front of her, as if the past had quietly taken its final position, exactly where it belonged. The applause faded into a softer hum as conversations began to overlap again, and somewhere near the center of the room, a server passed with a tray of champagne flutes that caught the light like fragments of something fragile and expensive, but at the back, where Evelyn remained seated, time seemed to move differently, slower, more deliberate, as if each second was being placed with intention rather than urgency, and she could feel the weight of a few glances that lingered longer than before. Not out of kindness, but curiosity, the kind that tries to solve a person like a puzzle without ever asking the right questions, and one woman, seated diagonally across from her, finally leaned in with a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes and said, "I did not realize you would be attending tonight." Her tone balanced carefully between surprise and something else less generous, and Evelyn turned her head just enough to acknowledge her, offering a small, composed smile in return, not defensive, not inviting, simply present, and for a moment, that seemed to unsettle the woman more than any sharp reply could have, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to interpret beyond what was plainly given, and the woman nodded, retreating back into her conversation, as if the exchange had not yielded the reaction she expected, and Evelyn returned her gaze to the front of the room, where Daniel now stood closer to the stage, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested control, as though every detail of the evening had unfolded exactly as he had envisioned, and perhaps, until now, it had, because he had not accounted for the one variable that could not be arranged or assigned a seat, the quiet resilience of someone who no longer needed to prove her place, and as the event continued, small moments began to accumulate, subtle but noticeable. A man passing by her table who hesitated before moving on, a glance from someone who seemed to recognize her but could not quite connect the version they remembered with the one sitting before them, and through it all, Evelyn remained unchanged in her composure, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, her shoulders aligned, her breathing steady, as if she were not waiting for anything to happen, but simply allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace. And then, almost imperceptibly, her attention shifted, not toward the stage, not toward the crowd, but toward the entrance at the far end of the ballroom, a set of tall glass doors framed by heavy curtains that parted each time a new guest arrived, and there was nothing unusual about them at first glance, just another point of entry, another transition between outside and in, but something in the way she looked at them suggested anticipation, not impatience, but certainty, as if she knew that the story everyone believed they were watching was incomplete, and that the next part had not yet been introduced, and she did not check the time, did not reach for her phone, did not signal to anyone, because whatever was coming did not require confirmation, it required presence, and so she stayed exactly where she was, in a seat that had been chosen to diminish her, wearing it instead like a quiet contradiction, and as another round of laughter rose near the front, louder this time, almost celebratory, Daniel lifted his glass again, his voice carrying across the room with practiced ease, but just as he began to speak, the sound of something distant, something outside the carefully controlled environment of the ballroom, began to thread its way inward, faint at first, almost lost beneath the music and conversation, but distinct enough to be noticed by those closest to the entrance, a low, smooth engine hum that did not belong to the rhythm of the evening, and one by one, a few heads turned, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, like a shift in attention that no one had planned, and Evelyn, without moving anything but her eyes, watched as the doors at the far end prepared to open once more, her expression unchanged, her stillness intact, as if the moment that had been building quietly beneath everything else was finally ready to reveal itself, not with noise, not with urgency, but with the kind of arrival that does not need to announce itself to be understood. The sound outside did not rush, it did not interrupt, it arrived with a kind of patience that felt almost intentional, like something that understood timing better than anyone inside the room, and as the glass doors at the far end slowly opened, a brief stream of cooler night air slipped into the ballroom, carrying with it that low, unmistakable hum, smooth and refined, the kind of sound that did not demand attention but inevitably drew it, and conversations began to thin at the edges, voices softening not because they were told to, but because something more compelling had entered the perimeter of awareness, and one of the attendants near the entrance paused mid-step, his posture shifting ever so slightly as he looked beyond the threshold, then stepped aside with a quiet formality that signaled a different kind of arrival, not louder, not grander, just different, and from her seat at the back, Evelyn did not lean forward, did not turn fully, she simply allowed her gaze to follow the subtle change in the room, the way attention migrated without instruction, the way curiosity replaced certainty in a matter of seconds, and in that moment, the past and present seemed to overlap for just a breath, because there had been a time when she did not know what came next, when every door that opened carried uncertainty instead of quiet assurance. But that was before mornings that began before sunrise, before learning how to build something from nothing but consistency and restraint, before three small voices filled a space that once echoed with absence, and the memory did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, like light through blinds, the soft weight of responsibility balanced against a kind of freedom she had never experienced before, the kind that came not from having everything, but from needing less, and there had been days when the numbers did not make sense, when time felt too short and expectations too large, but she moved through them the same way she moved now, without spectacle, without announcing effort, just one deliberate step at a time, and somewhere along that path, without a single defining moment to point to, something aligned, not perfectly, but enough to create stability, enough to build quietly in a way that did not require validation, and in those early months, long before anyone outside her world would have noticed, she had learned the rhythm of a life that answered to no one but her own standards, mornings measured in routines instead of reactions, afternoons shaped by intention instead of interruption, and evenings that closed not with questions, but with a sense of completion, however small, and it was during one of those afternoons, when the light came in at an angle that made everything look softer than it was, that she first noticed him. Not because he stood out, but because he did not try to. A man seated at a table near the window of a quiet cafe, his presence defined more by stillness than by movement, and their interaction had been simple, almost forgettable to anyone else, a brief exchange over something minor, a misplaced order, a moment of shared understanding that did not extend beyond what was necessary, and yet there was something in the way he listened, not waiting to respond, not measuring what to say next, just present in a way that felt rare, and she did not ask his name that day, did not linger because her life was not built around moments like that anymore, it was built around what needed to be done, what needed to be sustained, and so she returned to it, to her routines, to her responsibilities, to the quiet structure she had created piece by piece, and now back in the ballroom where everything was designed to be seen, she remained exactly as she had been when she walked in, composed, unhurried, untouched by the shifting attention that was no longer entirely focused on Daniel, and as the faint reflection of polished metal caught the light just beyond the doorway, and the outline of something unmistakably refined came into view, the room adjusted again, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to signal that whatever was arriving did not belong to the same narrative that had been playing moments before, and Evelyn, still seated at the back, did not move to claim the moment, because she did not need to. She had already stepped into it long before anyone else realized it had begun. The doors opened just wide enough for the outside world to slip into the carefully controlled atmosphere of the ballroom, and with it came the unmistakable presence of something that did not belong to the script Daniel had written for the evening, the polished front of a Bentley catching the ambient light as it rolled to a quiet, deliberate stop just beyond the threshold, its engines settling into silence with a kind of confidence that did not need to prove anything, and the shift inside the room was immediate but subtle, like a current changing direction beneath the surface, conversations pausing mid-sentence, heads turning not out of obligation but instinct, because certain arrivals carry their own gravity, and as the valet moved forward with a posture that reflected both training and recognition, the first door opened, not hurried, not dramatic, just precise, and a small pair of shoes touched the ground, followed by another, and then a third, three. Children stepping out one after the other with a natural ease that suggested they were not unfamiliar with being seen, their movements unforced, their presence quietly self-assured, and for a moment, the room did not react with words, it reacted with stillness, as if everyone needed a second longer to understand what they were looking at, because it was not just the car, not just the refinement of the arrival, it was the unexpected detail that did not fit into any assumption that had been made. Earlier in the night, and inside, near the center of the room, Daniel's voice faltered just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough to break the rhythm he had maintained so carefully, his attention pulled toward the entrance despite himself, while the woman beside him followed his gaze with a polite curiosity that had not yet turned into anything else, and at the back, Evelyn did not turn fully, did not rise. She simply allowed the moment to unfold with the same composure she had carried from the beginning, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged, as if nothing about this surprised her, as if this, too, was simply part of a sequence she had already accepted, and the children, dressed in soft, coordinated tones that reflected both care and intention without excess, paused just inside the doorway, their attention briefly scanning the room not with hesitation but with quiet awareness, as if they understood where they were without needing to be told, and then, from the other side of the car, the second door opened, and a man stepped out, his movements unhurried, his posture defined not by display but by certainty, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are without needing the room to confirm it, his suit tailored with the same understated precision as the vehicle behind him, his presence neither loud nor reserved, simply aligned, and as he straightened, his gaze moved once across the entrance, not searching, not scanning, just acknowledging before settling briefly in the direction of the back of the room, where Evelyn sat, still and composed, and though the distance between them remained, there was an unspoken recognition that required no gesture, no signal, and the valet stepped aside completely now, the pathway clear, the moment no longer contained to the doorway but beginning to enter the space itself. And inside, the carefully arranged balance of attention shifted again, not abruptly but undeniably, because whatever had just arrived was not part of the narrative that had been assumed. It was something else entirely, something that did not ask for permission to be included, and as the first quiet steps carried forward from the entrance, the room adjusted once more, not with noise, not with reaction, but with a growing awareness that the evening had just changed direction, and that the seat at the back of the room no longer meant what it was meant to mean when the night began. The first few steps they took into the ballroom did not echo loudly, but they carried, measured and steady against the polished floor, drawing the room's attention without ever demanding it, and the children walked beside him with an ease that felt practiced but not rehearsed, each step natural, each glance calm, as if they had been raised not to perform but simply to be, and their presence alone shifted something intangible in the air, because they did not look like an addition to a story. They looked like the center of one, and as they moved further inside, the details became clearer, the subtle coordination in their outfits, the quiet confidence in the way they held themselves, the way one of them reached instinctively for his hand without hesitation, not for guidance, but for connection, and he responded with the same effortless familiarity, a slight tightening of his fingers, a small acknowledgement that spoke more than any introduction could have, and across the room, Daniel's posture changed almost imperceptibly, his shoulders still squared, his expression still composed, but his attention no longer belonged to the speech he had been delivering. It was anchored now to something he could not immediately categorize, something that did not align with the expectations he had built for the night, and the woman beside him followed his line of sight again, her expression sharpening just slightly as curiosity began to give way to recognition that something significant was unfolding, though she could not yet define it, and around them, conversations did not resume. They hovered in suspension, as if the room itself was waiting for context before deciding how to react, and at the back, Evelyn remained seated, her stillness unchanged, but now there was a subtle shift in her focus, not outward, not toward the spectacle of arrival, but inward, as if something long settled had reached its natural conclusion, and she placed her glass down with the same quiet precision as before, her fingers releasing it without hesitation, her posture adjusting just enough to signal readiness rather than reaction, and as the man and the children approached further into the room, a few guests stepped slightly aside without being asked, creating a path that had not been planned but felt inevitable, because presence, when it is real, does not need to be announced. It reorganizes space on its own, and he did not look around for approval, did not pause for acknowledgement, his gaze steady, directed, until it reached the one place in the room that had been intentionally diminished, the table at the back, and there, for the first time, the distance between intention and reality became visible, because the person Daniel had placed out of view was now the quiet center of everything that mattered, and as the steps drew closer, the room seemed to recalibrate, not with sound, not with movement, but with awareness, the kind that settles in slowly and then all at once, and one of the children glanced up at him briefly, as if confirming something unspoken, and he gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, before their direction aligned completely toward Evelyn, and in that moment, the narrative that had been carefully constructed throughout the evening began to unravel without a single word being spoken, not dramatically, not abruptly, but with a quiet certainty that left no space for denial, and Daniel, standing at the front, where he had once controlled the room, found himself no longer at the center of its attention, his voice now irrelevant against the silent shift that had already taken hold, and Evelyn, still seated, still composed, lifted her gaze just enough to meet what was approaching, not with surprise, not with hesitation, but with recognition, as if she had never been waiting, only allowing the moment to arrive exactly when it was meant to, and as the final steps closed the distance, the room held its breath, not because something loud was about to happen, but because something undeniable already had. By the time they reached her table, the room had already shifted into something quieter, something more aware, as if every person present understood that whatever was about to happen did not belong to spectacle but to meaning, and the man stopped just a step away from Evelyn, not too close, not distant. exactly where presence becomes acknowledgement, and for a brief moment, nothing moved, not the guests, not the servers, not even Daniel at the front, who now stood with a glass still in his hand. And no words left to carry the room. And then, with a calm that felt almost instinctive, one of the children stepped slightly forward, their small hand brushing gently against the edge of the table as if grounding themselves in a space that had been prepared long before they arrived. And Evelyn looked at them, not with surprise, not with hesitation, but with a softness that had been absent from her expression all evening, something warmer, something deeply familiar. And she rose, slowly, without urgency, her chair making the faintest sound against the floor, a quiet contrast to the weight of the moment. And as she stood, the distance between past and present seemed to dissolve without effort, because this was not a return, this was a continuation, and the man inclined his head slightly, a gesture that carried respect without performance, and in that simple movement, the room began to understand that whatever connection existed here did not need explanation. It revealed itself through presence alone, and one of the guests near the center whispered something under their breath, the kind of comment meant to make sense of what they were seeing, but the words did not travel far because clarity does not always come from conversation. Sometimes it arrives through recognition, and Daniel, still positioned where he had once commanded attention, now found himself observing rather than directing, his expression tightening just enough to betray the shift he could not control, his gaze fixed on Evelyn in a way that suggested he was seeing her not as she had been, but as she was now, and perhaps for the first time, he realized that the version of her he had dismissed no longer existed, replaced by something he had not witnessed being built, something that stood fully formed without his awareness. And the woman beside him shifted her weight slightly, her earlier confidence replaced by a quieter uncertainty, her eyes moving between Daniel and the scene unfolding at the back, searching for cues that were no longer being given. And at the table, the children now stood close to Evelyn, one on each side, their presence natural, unforced, as if they belonged exactly where they were. And she rested her hand gently on one of their shoulders, not to guide, not to steady, but simply to connect. And the man beside them allowed a brief pause to settle before speaking, his voice low, measured, carrying just enough to reach those nearest without claiming the entire room. And though the words themselves were simple, the tone held something unmistakable, not authority imposed, but authority recognized. And as he addressed Evelyn, not with formality, not with distance, but with quiet familiarity, the final pieces of the evening's illusion began to fall away, because the narrative that had been built on assumption could no longer hold against what was plainly visible. And in that moment, without announcement, without declaration, the balance of the room shifted completely, not toward noise, not toward reaction, but toward understanding, the kind that does not need to be explained, because it is already felt. And Evelyn, standing where she had once been placed to be unseen, now stood at the center of something far more powerful than attention. She stood in her own certainty, untouched by the arrangement that had tried to define her. And as the silence deepened, not empty but full, it became clear to everyone present that this was not a confrontation, not a correction, but a quiet revelation, one that did not ask for acknowledgement, because it had already changed everything. The words he spoke did not travel far, but they did not need to, because the way he said her name carried enough weight to reshape the space around it, not louder, not sharper, just clearer than anything else that had been said that evening. And as that quiet acknowledgement settled, a subtle ripple moved through the room, not in sound but in understanding, the kind that shifts perception without asking permission. And Daniel felt it before he could define it, a tightening in the stillness, a loss of control that no gesture or correction could immediately restore. And he stepped forward slightly, not enough to draw full attention, but enough to re-enter the frame of the moment he had once directed, his expression composed but no longer effortless, his voice measured as he addressed the situation with a familiarity that now felt misplaced, calling Evelyn's name as if it still belonged to him in some way, as if the past could be reintroduced simply by speaking it aloud. But the room did not return to him. It remained where it had shifted, anchored by something more grounded than performance. and the man beside Evelyn turned just enough to acknowledge Daniel's presence without yielding the moment, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, and when he spoke again, it was not to explain, not to confront, but to clarify, his tone calm, deliberate, carrying the kind of authority that does not rise, it settles. And in a single sentence, simple in structure, but precise in meaning, he introduced himself not as someone new to the narrative, but as someone who had been part of a reality Daniel had never taken the time to understand, and recognition moved across a few faces in the room, subtle but immediate, the kind that comes when a name connects to something larger than the moment, something tied to influence, to decisions made in rooms far beyond this one, and the shift deepened, not dramatic, not chaotic, but undeniable, and Daniel's posture held. But the confidence that once defined it no longer carried the same weight because the context had changed, and with it, the position he thought he held, and beside Evelyn, the children remained calm, their presence steady, unaffected by the tension that others were beginning to feel, because for them, this was not disruption, it was continuity, and one of them looked up at her with a quiet familiarity that spoke more clearly than any introduction could have, and she responded with the smallest nod, a gesture so natural it almost went unnoticed. But within it was something complete, something resolved, and the man's hand rested lightly at her back, not guiding, not claiming, simply present, a point of quiet support that required no explanation, and around them, the room no longer searched for cues from Daniel. It adjusted to what was unfolding without needing permission, because clarity, once revealed, does not return to confusion, and Daniel, standing now within a moment he did not control, realized that the arrangement he had designed had not failed in execution, it had failed in understanding, because the person he had placed at the edge of the room was never defined by where she sat, and the narrative he had tried to maintain no longer aligned with what was visible, and Evelyn, standing with a calm that had never once asked for recognition, did not address him, did not respond, did not correct anything he had implied, because there was nothing left to prove, and as the silence settled once more, not empty but full, the final distinction became clear, not through words, not through confrontation, but through presence alone, that she had not returned to be seen differently, she had arrived already changed, and the room, whether ready or not, had simply caught up. No one announced the end of the moment, but everyone felt it settle into place, like the final note of a song that does not need to be extended to be complete, and for a few seconds, the room remained suspended in that quiet understanding, where no one rushed to speak because there was nothing left to clarify, and Evelyn did not look toward Daniel, not out of avoidance, but because he no longer occupied the space he once held in her world, and that absence was not cold, it was simply resolved, like a door that had been closed long enough to no longer echo when touched, and beside her, the children shifted slightly, one adjusting their sleeve, another glancing up at her with the same steady calm they had carried from the moment they arrived, and she responded with a faint smile, the kind that belongs to everyday life rather than performance, a softness that did not seek approval, and the man at her side remained exactly where he was, present without overshadowing, his attention aligned with hers rather than directing it, and together, without any signal exchanged, they began to move, not toward the center of the room, not toward the stage, but toward the exit, their steps unhurried, their path naturally opening as guests instinctively made space, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, because something about their presence had redefined the evening in a way no one could ignore, and as they passed through the room, the earlier arrangement of tables, of positions, of perceived importance, felt less like structure and more like suggestion, something that could be rearranged without resistance, and Daniel stood where he had been, his hand lowering slowly from where it had held the glass, his expression no longer fixed but searching, as if trying to locate the version of the night he had planned, but it was no longer there, replaced by something he had not anticipated and could not reclaim. And the woman beside him said nothing, her earlier composure softened into a quiet stillness that mirrored the rest of the room, because even she understood that whatever had just unfolded did not belong to comparison or competition, it belonged to realization, and as Evelyn reached the doorway, The same doors that had opened to let her moment arrive now opened again without ceremony, and the cooler night air met her once more. But this time it carried no tension, no uncertainty, only a sense of continuation. And the Bentley remained waiting just beyond, its presence unchanged, not as a symbol to be displayed, but as part of a life already in motion. And one of the children reached for her hand, and she took it naturally, without pause, as if that connection was the only thing that mattered. And before stepping outside, she paused for the briefest moment, not to look back, not to reconsider, but simply to exist in the exact point where past and present no longer overlapped, where everything that had been left behind stayed behind without resistance. And then she stepped forward, the man and the children beside her, the door closing gently behind them, not with finality, but with quiet certainty. And inside, the room slowly returned to sound, to movement, to conversation. But nothing resumed in quite the same way, because something had shifted beneath it all, something that would not be undone by noise or distraction. And Daniel, standing in the space he had once controlled, now understood without being told that the story he thought he had ended had continued without him, and not in opposition, not in revenge, but in something far more complete, and somewhere beyond the doors, beyond the lights and the arrangement and the assumptions. Evelyn Carter did not carry the night with her. She left it exactly where it belonged, because she had not come back to reclaim anything. She had come to reveal that she no longer needed to.